few more people may trickle in. We'll go ahead and get started today. My name is Robin Hale. I'm a GIS project manager at WDFW, and we'll be doing a workshop today, part one of our VSP workshop for the high resolution change detection data. Presenting with me is Emma LaValle, one of our GIS and image analysts. Hey, we're all in downtown Olympia today, a few other folks in the room. We'll have several people presenting throughout the day, the next hour and a half. So our agenda for today, we will be starting with an introduction to the voluntary stewardship program for those of you who are not yet familiar with that, 5 to 10 minutes there. And then we'll switch over to an introduction to the high resolution change detection data that we produce. From there, we'll get into the details. We'll get behind the scenes of the data, looking at how the data is made, and which will help us understand the quality assurance and quality control of the data. From there, we'll bring it all back together. We'll have an example from San Juan County and how they've incorporated the high resolution change detection data into their VSP monitoring work plan and monitoring those indicators. And finally, we'll look into what do you do next? How do you go from here? How do you learn more about the data sets? And hopefully there'll be time for Q&A at the end of the hour. So quick introduction of who we are and what drives us. Our project with we are with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. Our mandate is to preserve, protect, perpetuate, and manage the fish and wildlife of the state. And eventually the habitat is also added onto that. So we are housed in the habitat program alongside programs like PHS, or priority habitats and species. And so we're also protecting the habitats and ecosystems of the states that our fish and wildlife depend on. In 2006 and 2009, the USDA's National Agriculture Imagery Program produced 1 meter or 3 foot imagery for the state of Washington. And having these 2 sets of imagery for the entire state really changed what we thought, hey, we can start to compare this. And how can we start to use this new data set to analyze changes on the land and analyze what's happening to the habitats across the state? And the Salmon Recovery Funding Board awarded DFW money to look into this and how can we best leverage this new NAEP imagery in order to do that. That is, Ken Pierce created this project starting there, and that's sort of the processes that we've been using since then. Several years later, along came VSP. And as we'll get into, VSP had several requirements, including going back to 2011 as a baseline and asking counties to show that there's no net loss in the functions and values of critical areas. And with that, there's a great need for monitoring data, like accurate and representative and ongoing data. And also this ability to summarize results by RIA, by county, and what's happening on agricultural lands. And our high resolution change detection data really fit that and fits all of these needs and seem to be a really good fit. So now I will pass it off to Sarah and Levi to present on the voluntary stewardship program.
Great, thank you, Robin. Can everyone hear me all right online?
Yes.
Great, hi Levi. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Wilcox, and I'm with the State Conservation Commission. My role is the interim voluntary stewardship program coordinator. We will be working on getting a full-time person here shortly. We have a full-time, but a long-term person or people. So in the meantime, you've got me, and I've got about almost 2 years of experience with this program. So I'm really happy to be here with you. As you can see from the map, VSP is spread throughout Washington state. We have 27 participating counties that have VSP programs operating. As Robin mentioned, 2011 is kind of our baseline year, and that's when our first 2 counties began this program after many years of conception and back and forth working with various stakeholders to put into place. Next slide, please. A program that could help provide an alternative to the Growth Management Act and counties needing to follow plans and regulation around critical areas, particularly where farming was concerned. So VSP provides an alternative to regulation for counties and landowners to implement voluntary site-specific practices that help protect critical areas while also promoting agriculture. That's the key there. And so we looked at the map just a minute ago, and the gray areas are those counties that are yet to be enrolled. And as of last year, the state legislature reopened the statute to allow those folks to join when they're ready to do so at any time if they choose to do so. Next slide, please. So what are these critical areas that we're speaking of? We are thinking here of wildlife habitat, wetlands, frequently flooded areas, aquifer recharge areas, and geologically hazardous areas. Now, each county is going to have a very different type of critical area and agricultural mix as we see them on the landscape. So each program is tailored to meet that in their local area. Next slide, please. And how does it actually work on the ground? So counties come together with volunteer work groups made up of local stakeholders and tribal folks and farmers and folks who are interested in making sure that this goes according to plan. And they come together and they create a work plan around how they can best analyze. They make goals and benchmarks for how they're going to be looking at their critical areas. And so they develop a countywide work plan, and they come together to do projects. They work with, I don't know, all different types of folks to get work done on the ground. They have technical service providers. This is a county program, by the way, housed at the county level. And your technical service providers, in most cases, are conservation districts. Districts have those on the ground relationships with producers in the area. They go out to people's farms and they put together plans looking at what the landscape is and what best management practices could help protect and enhance critical areas on that landscape. And then they come back, and that's where the projects come in and work with multiple sets of funders and funding mechanisms to get those done on the ground, often offering cost share and technical assistance to get it done. We go back and then we do some monitoring and see how is this working at a watershed scale, not just parcel, but at a watershed scale. And Levi's going to speak to that in just a moment. Next slide, please. Just to note that this is not done just at the commission. We are the administrator of the program, but we have multiple partners and state agency partners in crime on this. So that's one reason why we're here today with DFW. We also work with the State Department of Ecology, with Fish and Wildlife, I mentioned already, sorry, but WSDA with the state ag folks, and then looking to other organizations and county commissioners as well for support and for policy advice as we go. Next slide, please. I have two more things I want to highlight that are really important about making VSP successful, and that's the watershed work groups that I mentioned earlier. They're really one of the most important parts and critical to the success of VSP, and they're involved on many different levels in their community. So looking at who might be part of a work group, you could have conservation districts, of course, you could have county water departments, ag producers, land rights groups, colleges and universities, different types of producer associations, and also agency staff. And all of that comes together to once again put together the work plan and really make the project sing on the ground. Next slide, one more, and then I'll pass it to Levi. A quick shout out for technical service providers again, and in most cases, except for I think about 2 cases, everyone uses conservation, the counties use conservation districts for their technical service providers. And again, they really have a trusted relationship in the community with producers. And so they can go out and often have done other projects with landowners already. And putting these individual stewardship plans together for landowners just gives them kind of an umbrella picture of what can happen on that landscape. And they can help find the funding either through SCC, all of our other programs, through VSP specifically now, we have money for on-the-ground projects, or through other grants and whatnot to get those projects done. So now I will pass you on to the real brains of the operation, Levi Kiesacker.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Robin, for the introduction. I just wanted to briefly go over a little bit of the sort of VSP monitoring fundamentals before the rest of the group goes into some of the details on the HRCD. Next slide, please. So I think it's good thinking about big picture. How does monitoring and data fit into the voluntary stewardship program? There's actually a lot of ways that data and information and monitoring can help inform the program in terms of community participation, the effects on agricultural viability, understanding where conservation practices are implemented. Today, I feel like HRCD has been mostly used in terms of the effectiveness. So how effective are the activities on a landscape or in a watershed at conserving natural resources and critical area functions and values, but also to plant seeds that there's other ways we can use monitoring and data to help inform the project besides just effectiveness monitoring. Next slide, please. So within monitoring or within VSP, when we talk about effectiveness monitoring, we're talking about the effects at the watershed scale. And so VSP counties have to demonstrate every 5 years the reporting through science and data that is reviewed by the technical panel that Sarah highlighted about 4 slides ago, to evaluate whether the functions and values of critical areas are protected relative to that magic 2011 year. Next slide, please. And when we talk about functions and values, we actually have a list of them for the various critical area types that's been informed from a lot of our partners, as well as commission staff and district staff and others. That is located on the commission's VSP website. You can find the VSP monitoring guide that lists of all these functions. This is a living document, so we will probably add to them. So if you have functions that you think are important, please reach out. We can add those. But the idea here is trying to use monitoring to capture these functions and then be able to tell the trend of that function over time relative to 2011, which can be tricky. So one of the purposes of today is to highlight one of these tools, HRCD, and think about how we can use that tool to address these needs. Next slide, please. This is just a sort of a visual illustration of that concept. This comes right from the VSP monitoring guide that has a lot more detail about all of these topics. Also on the website are a bunch of webinars that address a lot of these topics as well, and there's slide decks posted if you don't want to watch the whole recording. So just FYI for folks who want to dig in deeper. But the basic concept here is trying to summarize functions and values over time. And if you could, those green arrows would represent, well, that's an increase in the function, and the red arrow would be a decrease in the function. And the gray side-to-side arrows are like the function stayed the same. The idea being if you can sum all that up at a watershed scale, you have to figure out what way is the dial moving. We want to at least be at the protection level. So protection or enhancement is the goal. Next slide, please. So this is another aspect of monitoring that's important at the watershed scale, is that we're not just counting things like, is it the same amount of habitat that existed in 2011 that exists now? It's also what is the quality of the functions and values, right? And so different data sets give you different lenses to be able to assess quality versus presence absence. And so just wanted to throw this out there as you're thinking about how to apply HRCD to your VSP monitoring. Next slide, please. Another really important part of monitoring within VSP is to meet sort of scientific standards so that everyone has confidence in the information that we're using to make decisions. And so we have a lot of resources to help folks do that. If you have a phone out, you can use your camera and go to that QR code, and it will take you to the monitoring website at the commission, or you can just Google it. There we have the library of resources, which is a list of a whole bunch of resources to help you do this, our monitoring guide, as well as additional data sets, including HRCD, to help you with your VSP monitoring. Next slide, please. And so I mentioned this before, but one of the key essential parts of monitoring in VSP is that the data that we're using meets those standards that I mentioned. And so we have a whole section in the VSP monitoring guide that goes over this. It's related to the monitoring plans, VSP monitoring plans, which are due at the end of June. And we have also a couple of, we just had a monitoring plan session on April 30th. That's on the website. If you missed it, you can go watch it or look at the slides. We have another part 2 of that monitoring plan session next week. So just plugging that. But the idea here is it's really important to understand what is the quality of the data that we're using for those 5 reports for your ongoing adaptive management within your VSP. And these are some of the themes that we highlight in the monitoring guide, and that I believe Robin will be and Emma will be talking about in their presentation as well. So I'm going to leave it. I think that's my last slide. So thank you. Handing off. I just want to say thank you to everyone who's joined us today. And thanks again to San Juan folks for coming to present your case study as well. And then thanks to all of our co-hosts today. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Levi. So we are going to try and do some interactive questions to see who our audience is today. And our first question, I hope you want to introduce this.
Yeah, so what you can do is up on the screen, we have a QR code. And so we're just trying to figure out a little bit how familiar you are with DFW's high resolution change detection data. So the data we're talking about today. So you can get your phone out and you can either use that QR code with your camera or you can join at slido.com. And as people are going through with that, we have about 6 people so far. We'll see the bars changing. So we'll give a little bit of time here for people to access that. We'll be doing a few more slides with Slido throughout the time. So if you want to, you can either QR code it each time, or you can just leave it open on your phone and it'll keep coming up. With about 26 people who've done this, and about half, a little bit more than half, are a little bit familiar, have heard it, haven't used it much. We have a few that are very familiar with it, and then the other half somewhat familiar to not at all familiar. Awesome.
Hopefully by the end of the day, more of you will be a little bit more familiar with the data and have a little bit more confidence in using it after this workshop and the following workshop that we're doing. Wonderful.
Yeah. We'll move forward. Y'all can still use that QR code and you can still be putting answers in there if you want. But we're going to move into what is HRCD, high resolution change detection. So let's dive right into the deep end. So for our data, spatial resolution matters. This is the basis of our data. As Robin was saying, we use that 1 meter, 3 foot resolution NAEP data from USDA. And that's on the screen, we're comparing that to sort of the typical 30 meter resolution. And when we use the 1 meter resolution, we're able to analyze change and land cover at a much smaller scale. So if you're looking at that 30 meter, you can't really accurately track changes in houses or roads or trees. But in our 1 meter resolution, we can identify and detect all of these features. And we can see things like construction changes or loss of trees due to floods. So we identify these small scale changes for these large scale trends. We can also accurately map and track changes within things like the zones of influence for the riparian areas, which you can see on this 1 meter resolution image as well. So when I say track changes, what am I talking about? So what is change is sort of a broad thing, but what is change within high resolution change detection within our team is very specific. So we are looking at things that have a tangible impact on the habitat and that are permanent changes as well. So our tree canopy loss on the left-hand side of your screen, this is depicting, there's that large swath of trees, sort of like mid-upper left side. And that has been taken out. So humans have taken out those trees. We also have some other types of tree canopy loss. So for example, forestry would be within that. Fires that have taken out areas of trees. There might be a space that has a few trees taken out here and there. or a large swath like this example. Sometimes that's leading to agriculture or development, and we'll get into that in a little bit. When we're talking about tree canopy loss, our trees that we're speaking of are considered to be taller than a one-story house. So if we see something that is vegetative and it's taller than a one-story house, we're going to call that a tree. Some of our other changes that we take a look at are the impervious surface increase. So this is our middle example. And in this example, we are showing an increase in houses. And I guess I should clarify, the top level is the year, the start year, and the bottom level of imagery is the end year. So in this example, we have that increase in homes. And another thing that could also be an impervious surface increase is an increase in roads. So let's say that grassy area didn't have anything on it, it was just grassy. Then there would be an increase in the roads and in the homes. Our third example is the semi-pervious surface increase. And this is our third change that we capture. It's a little bit hard to see, but there's a gravel road in like the very middle of that grassy area. And that gravel road is an increase in semi-pervious surface. We chose these to make sure that we're tracking changes that have a strong impact on riparian conditions and that are also widely agreed upon as good indicators for habitat change. What you might not be seeing here is that we don't capture tree gain. So tree gain is difficult in the 2-year timeframes that we do our change tracking, as the trees are slower growing. And a lot of vegetation would look like tree growth. And so our data set, we have tree canopy loss, we have impervious surface increase, semi-pervious surface increase, and we do not capture the tree gain. So here's some other examples that we have. So one of those is this like deeper dive into what we're looking at. So us analysts, we take a look at these changes, and the whole state is separated into these smaller areas that we can look at with a known acreage that we call polygons or segments. So that's what you're looking at with the orange and the purple on this screen. So I'll look at this, I'll take a look at 2017 to further explore this change, and I'll see that there's a stand of trees sort of in that middle area, and up in that upper right area, there's also another stand of trees. I see some bushes and I see some grass as well. And then in 2019, I see houses, there's some foundations, there's a road and new sidewalk as well. So those are all things that I will be tracking. And Robin will go into more detail about these segments or polygons if you're curious about that. She'll do that in a little bit. So when I'm looking at the change in these, I'm taking a look at how much has changed. So I see from 2017 to 2019, we have a 25% tree canopy loss. We take a look at the changes at 0% of the polygon or the segment, 25%, 50%, 75%, or 100% change. So I'm seeing there's 25% tree canopy loss. If I take a look at 2019, I'm seeing there's about 25% new impervious. So those houses, those roads, that sidewalk. And then I'm not seeing any new semi-pervious. And so I'm looking at this and I'm looking at our tracked changes. So what we track, and I'm seeing about 50% of the polygon has a change. So our total change is 50%. Something that is unique about our data set, because analysts look at every single one of the change polygons, we're able to determine the change origin and the cause of change. So for this, I would say that it's human caused and that change origin is due to development. And every single change polygon gets these types of attributes. Another example of change would be along this riverfront. You see that there's on the left-hand side from 2011 there's a group of trees within that purple polygon or that purple segment. And then 2017, those trees are no longer there. And there's some clues in here that indicate to us that that is a human-caused change. We look at the flip side to that, we see this imagery from 2015 to 2017, and within that red polygon or that red segment, you can see that the river has caused these trees to go away. So this is a natural change. So this would be categorized as natural stream. On the left-hand side is that natural, that stream. Other things that may go into natural would be landslide, fire, insect die-off. Those things might go within natural. And on our human cause side, we have other things like forestry, development, other anthropogenic, so other human cause, possibly quarries or another commercial thing, retention ponds, redevelopment, and then our tree loss. If we take a look at all of those changes that we've had from 2006 to 2021, this is a map of all of that data based off of those causes of change. And because we have that information, we're able to see things like those blue spots in the middle of the state or on the east side, that those are due to fires. So it looks like there's change, but then we know more information about that change.
So now we know a little bit, a good introduction on our data. Thank you, Emma. We're going to come back and think back to what Levi was talking about in the monitoring guide and data in general. So we have one more question, another poll for you. And so this question is, generally speaking, if you're thinking about data in general, not necessarily our data, what data quality elements give you confidence in data? Can provide one word answer and enter up to 3 times. It should give us a word cloud. Stuff up here. Again, you can use your QR code or join at slido.com.
It's a little like a race.
Words that are bigger have been entered in more times. So we see repeatability, accuracy are standing out, metadata. Ground truthing. Industry accepted methods. Confidence. Great. Peer reviewed. So we will be looking at these. I see a lot, I kind of seeing a couple themes here. One is about accuracy, one is about the quality at the end, and part of it's about how the data is created, which is really great to kind of see both of these themes showing up. And how do we have confidence in there? How good is the data and how is it created? It's ground truthing that meet industry standards, is repeatable and accurate. Okay, we can continue to add to that. We will gather this at the end more. Okay, so we have, so with that, I'm actually going to dive into the data creation process. So bear with me for a second. We're going to get into the weeds a little bit. But knowing more about how our data is created, I think will help you understand the quality of the data and be able to assess whether or not these data will fit your needs for your monitoring in your county and give you more confidence in the data. So the data creation process, 4 major steps that I'll go through. I'll talk about our input imagery and data. What data sets do we start with? A process that we call change segmentation into our model. And then finally, our analyst review. So a data product can only be as good as what we start out with. And so we start out with first the nape imagery that I mentioned before. And you can see that in the upper left image. We see a picture with roads and some grass and a lake and some trees. And that's sort of the standard image that you might see, imagery that you might see. The nape imagery also has an infrared band, which is something that's reflected by healthy vegetation in that upper right-hand corner. And we use both the color image that you're used to seeing and that infrared band and create this vegetation index, which you can see in the lower right. And that vegetation index helps us to show areas of vegetation and healthy vegetation versus non-vegetated areas. So the white areas are where there's vegetation, and the gray areas and the black areas are non-vegetated. And this is really helpful because sometimes lakes and shadows and dark trees and fake fields for playing sports on all kind of look similar. And so this can help us differentiate between those and help the model really differentiate as well. And then next, the final layer that you see here, we use LiDAR data, and the LiDAR tells us the elevation of the surface of the Earth. And it tells us that base elevation. And then we also use a digital surface model, or DSM, which tells us the heights of the features on the Earth, the tops of a building or the top of a tree. And we combine the LiDAR with the digital surface model to create this calculated height model, which is that lower left image. And in the green, you'll see those objects are taller objects. And the medium height objects are kind of orange and yellow in this image. And then features that are on the ground's level are going to be gray. And we use the digital surface model as the height of the features because the digital surface model is created from the nape imagery that's collected. And I won't get into the details of the process, but that means that the height of the feature is taken on the same day at the same time as the image itself. And so we know that it's still there. If we see a big change in height, we know that there's been a big change here. But people say, why don't you just use LiDAR all the time? And one, it's really expensive. And two, LiDAR isn't collected at the same time as the nape imagery. And so there might be differences if a building was built between the time that the LiDAR was taken and the nape imagery was flown. It's hard to compare those. So we love using this DSM. And finally, we use visible surface water data that we create in-house. And that helps to clean up some of the boundaries and some of the irregularities in the DSM as well. All of these data sets are using 1 to 3 foot spatial resolution. So that kind of is our base resolution that we start with that Emma showed at the beginning. So once we have our input data sets, we can create polygon segments. And we don't want to compare every single pixel in the image. That sounds like a lot of work for a computer or model to do. So we group similar pixels together, things that have similar heights, similar vegetation qualities, similar colors to our eyes, and we group them together. So on the left, you see a group of trees grouped, or a polygon with a pink around one of the buildings, or the road is separate from the field or separate from the gravel parking lot. And you can see in the middle image that these polygon segments can be widely different sizes based off of how similar something is. So a large agricultural field that doesn't have a lot of variation in it from this scale may be a really large polygon segment, but then in like an urban area with lots of trees and buildings might have smaller polygon segments. And overall in a county, we might have millions of polygons to look at. We use a program called eCognition to do this, those who are interested. And then we take these polygons, again, we don't want to look at every pixel individually, and we don't want to analyze every segment, these polygon segments individually. So we use a model to predict change. We have a ton of training data that we incorporate and use this to model how likely each of those polygon segments are to have changed. What's its a likelihood of change? And we divide those millions of polygon segments into 2 buckets. The first bucket is hey, the model says this is not likely to have changed. It's less than 25% chance of change. And we're saying that's assumed to be not a change. We then, in order for accuracy, we look at a random sample, about 1% of those polygons. And it's most of the county will honestly end up in this bucket. And look at 1% of those to assess the accuracy of the model. And this tells us how much change we missed by the model, how accurate, how good is our model. And that gives us our omission rate. And then anything that was greater than 25% chance of change, we assumed has changed. And every single one of those is reviewed by an analyst. And this is really a unique thing that we do that a lot of change detection products don't do, is we look at every single change manually. A lot of places will just stop with the model that says it changed or not, and kind of go from there. But we take this an extra step. I'm gonna went into this a little bit. So when the analysts, we have some wonderful analysts who look at all of these change segments. We have 500,000 change segments or changes that we've published so far. And someone has looked at every single one of those. So if they look at it, 2 sets of images, one from say 2011 and 2017, and they compare the two. And if they look at it and they say, there's no change, actually, the model was wrong. I see why it chose this, but the model isn't correct. We just remove that from the data set. And that means that we're not including false changes into our data set. And then if there is a change, that's when an analyst will apply all the attributes to each change, including the cause of change, like was it development or was it forestry related, and the type of change here as well. So in this example between these 2 images, you can see that a new house was built here. So that's new impervious surface, and start to add information about that. And our changes are all reviewed in 2 to 6 year time spans. So captured in 2 to 6 year time spans, we're looking at 2 images, 2011 to 2017, or 2017 to 2019. And it varies by county based off of funding and the history of the program. So a county like Columbia County currently has 3 data sets available in a 6 year time span and then 2 year time span. San Juan County was receiving the data before VSP existed, and so actually has data back to 2006 in a 3 year time span, followed by a series of 2 year time spans. I saw a lot of things in the word cloud about ground truthing, and so that's an interesting, how do you go back if you have this baseline of 2011? How do you go back in time to see what was there in 2011? And while we don't go out into the field to verify these changes, we do look at this imagery to see what was captured in 2011. It's kind of a way of going back in time to do ground truthing in the past to see what was there. So now that we understand how the data is made, I'm going to go into some details of some quality assurance, and I'm going to read through some of these. These slide decks are going to be available. But gives you some ideas of what our data includes and the quality of our data. 2 seconds. So as Emma mentioned, our data is relevant. We capture permanent, things can grow back, but permanent real world changes that impact the functions and values of critical areas. Our data is customizable. So because we have all these attributes, there's the ability to filter out. Say you don't want to be responsible for the natural changes to the landscape. You can remove those from the data set. Or say you're only interested in tree loss or only interested in new impervious surface. You can separate those out. And that's our data's focus. So it captures only 3 types of change. Okay? The loss of tree canopy and the new impervious or new semi-pervious, so new roads or gravel. But that means it does not capture tree growth, which I know is something that could be interesting and valuable to a lot of VSP programs. However, the data does, because it's spatial data and can be used in a GIS, integrates really well with other data sets. So we'll talk a little bit about how we can integrate this tree growth information that you may be collecting somewhere else and integrate with this tree loss information. The data is scalable, so it's easy to aggregate by county or RIA. On the flip side of that, while we do collect small site scale changes, we don't recommend site scale decisions to be made without a site visit. There's some spatial certainty. I will get into this next box about spatial certainty in part 2, workshop part 2, and we'll talk about how this applies to VSP monitoring and how you analyze data. But basically, whenever there's a polygon full of change and say it has 100% of the polygon experience tree loss, we know exactly anywhere in there where there's tree loss. But within that polygon, we could also say, well, after those trees were removed, 25% of it gained a building. But we don't actually know, we don't indicate where within that polygon the building came in. So that's where the spatial uncertainty might come in. These blue boxes are words that are pulled directly from the monitoring guide that Levi mentioned earlier. So talk about bias, which we try to minimize bias through in-depth analyst training and having really strict guidelines on what counts as a change, how do we estimate percentages. Also, of course, the model helps to take out some of that human bias that we might pull in. We have accuracy and precision for our data sets. The combination of using the model and the analyst review process gives us fairly high accuracy for our data set. So our classification accuracy for the entire county is 99.9%, indicating whether it's a change or not. Our commission error, which is, did we include a fake change or a false change in our data set? The analyst review process brings it down to 0. And then that random sample that we do of the areas that we said didn't change, we found that our emission rate, the changes that we missed, is about 10% of the changes. It's our emission rate. There's also information in the monitoring guide about sensitivity or detection limits. And this is really guided by the input data that we receive and start out with. And so, like I mentioned, all of our data is starting with that 3-foot or 1-foot data as our base input. So that's sort of that spatial resolution that we're starting with. And that allows us to detect things like houses and trees and that kind of size feature up to large forests. But it wouldn't allow us to say, identify a single animal in a field, right? We can't identify features, that's all. So that's where those limits are. The data is representative. Our model is completed for an entire county, as long as there's LiDAR available in the county, including all agricultural lands. And for completeness, the data is available back to 2011. So for VSP folks who are looking at changes from 2011 to present, we can see that back to 2011. There is a 2-year wait for updates in order for us to process the data and get there. So it's not always completely up to date. So it depends on the last couple of years you may or may not have information for. And finally, our data is comparable. So over time, our process has improved and evolved in order to improve our efficiency, but we have consistent results and consistent attributes since the data started in 2011, even back to 2006. Okay, so that's the most technical we get. If you're all still with us, then we should continue from there. So now we're going to move on to, sorry about that, our next Slido question. I'm thinking about how to incorporate this into VSP. Is which of the following in your county could be impacted by changes in tree canopy or development of impervious surface? A lot of acronyms in here. We're seeing a lot of people are saying that wetland function and values are impacted by these things. Fish and wildlife, habitat conservation areas, function and values, including riparian areas, are impacted by these changes. To a lesser degree, we have flooding areas, awkward for recharge. Agricultural viability is impacted. Yeah. So depending on your county, these data sets can be used to monitor the different critical areas and agricultural viability, depending on your needs and what's happening in your county. The data has been used for so many things. There's so many different questions that we can ask. I'm trying to narrow it down to specific for VSP. One question might be, how many acres of tree canopy were lost due to humans during a time span in riparian areas on agricultural lands? We could actually get a very specific number to that. We could ask a different question, how many acres of impervious surface were gained in a similar time span? So to give one example of how the data has been used, I'm going to pass this off to Pauline and Maggie with the San Juan Islands Conservation District.
Thanks, Robin, and hi, everyone. I'm Pauline Chique with the San Juan Islands Conservation District VSP coordinator, and I'm joined today by Maggie Long, who is our VSP intern and data technician. Next slide. So just a little bit of overview. I really wanted to give an example today of how we use HRCD in our county's work plan to show you what we're asking of the data, what we need to run the analysis, and give sort of a big level picture of one example of a stream change analysis, and then talk a little bit about how we interpret those results for VSP reporting. In our work plan, so it was developed in 2018. We also created an adaptive management plan in 2021 when we did our first 5-year report and basically found that we weren't meeting our benchmarks and goals. So we adaptively managed and included HRCD in this new adaptive management plan. So we use HRCD in all 5 of our critical areas to measure, as Robin and others have mentioned today, impervious surface, semi-impervious surface, and can-be cover changes. And really this informs our effectiveness monitoring. So we break our monitoring program into implementation monitoring, effectiveness monitoring, and participation monitoring. The implementation monitoring is what has been put on the ground in terms of best management practices, and other sort of measurable metrics that are just the sort of what. And effectiveness monitoring really measures how those practices are impacting critical area functions and values. So as folks have mentioned before today, HRCD is not designed to measure habitat gains. So it'll only inform our monitoring progress towards protection goals and not enhancement goals. And in our county, we break out those 2 goals as separate goals. And I'll show you a little bit more about that in the next slide. Here is a table from our adaptive management plan in 2021, where we outline each of the goals and benchmarks as they relate to HRCD. And I'll go through each one. Again, these are protection goals and not enhancement goals. So in the case of wetlands, for example, where you see goal 1 to protect wetland functions related to water quality, water quantity, and habitat, we also have a goal 2 in wetlands that is to enhance wetland functions related to water quality, quantity, and habitat. So I'm just talking about protection benchmarks here. And the benchmark then that goes with this wetlands is using HRCD to see if we are maintaining baseline rates of canopy loss and semi-impervious and semi-impervious gain within wetlands. And this is the same for all 5 critical areas. We also break up fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas by streams. So we're talking about fish here, and then also by upland habitat. So you'll see these goals and benchmarks look pretty much the same for all 5 critical areas, and we're really focused on this baseline rate of change. So instead of saying, let's say we want to avoid all change in the county, which is sort of a hard thing to do, just given natural causes, given development is always happening, we're saying that our goal is to maintain the baseline rate. So using 2011 as our baseline year, has the rate of change changed over time? And that's really the key piece that I wanted to highlight here is just that is the rate changing itself, not is there change happening? Next slide. So what are we asking of the data? And these are some questions we've already talked about today, but how have the functions and values of critical areas in ag lands changed over time? And what are the specific acres of change in each critical area where they intersect with ag parcels? So we're looking at, you have an ag parcel, what's the area within that ag parcel that intersects with critical areas that's changed, and why has it changed, essentially? Next slide. So a couple things we need at our county to run the analysis, and I'll backtrack a little bit and say that in San Juan County, VSP is run through the Conservation District. We have our own team of planners and our own GIS specialist who help run this sort of analysis. And it's pretty key for us to have a GIS analysis. It can get fairly technical. For those who are newer to GIS, you could potentially learn how to do it, but having someone who has skills already has been hugely valuable to us. And really, we also pull a lot of other spatial data sets in addition to HRCD to make this picture complete. So in those specific data sets, we're looking at our county's stream layers, we're looking at wetland layers to be able to pull areas of interest and then analyze them through HRCD. Next slide. I wanted to show an example using an intersection of agriculture parcels with streams in San Juan County. And this example, we will go into a deeper dive of all of our sort of change within each critical area. That'll be in part 2, but I just want to give an overview to showcase what's possible with this data and to give you a sense of how San Juan County is using it for just one critical area today. Next slide. So I mentioned before that we pull different layers from other sources aside from HRCD. And I'll highlight just a couple of those today for this example, but the first one is farm parcels. So we have San Juan County tax parcels, and we ground truth a lot of these. And then every time an ISP and individual stewardship plan is developed, we also verify it through our GIS database. Next slide. And our stream layer is also sourced from the county, who sources it from the Wild Fish Conservancy's website. And that showcases all of the streams in the county. And then what we do is pull a 200-foot buffer around those streams to make sure that we're including all reaches of stream and ag intersect. Next slide. And really, after we run the analysis, and that'll be in the part 2 of this, but we get something that looks like this. So this is a table that shows change and baseline rates of change from different time periods. So if we start all the way in the right column, we see the changes that occurred from 2006 to 2011. And again, we were lucky enough to have that data from 2006. So we had data before VSP came into play, before the baseline year essentially was established. And we can say then that our baseline rate of change that we're referring to in our work plan is this right column of data. So for each critical area, we've assessed what are the acres of change in that 5-year period and what's the rate of change per year. And that's what you're seeing in the broken out columns. And I want to highlight just the streams one for now, but you'll see that 1.07 acres changed from 2006 to 2011, which indicates a 0.2 rate of change over those per year, essentially. Then what we can do is look at data since 2011, and that's that middle column. From 2011 to 2019, which is the last year that we have data that we've analyzed, we found that we had a 0.27 rate of change in that critical area, meaning that given that example, our rate of change is now greater than it was compared to the baseline, meaning that we've failed in this goal or benchmark if we're using just this data. And then you'll see if you want to break it out by what are the 2-year periods where you can see the most or the least change, you'll actually see in these most recent 2 years in the left column, we had a much lower rate of change than either of those two numbers. So you can track these things also in a larger time frame, or you can break it up by what are the years and what sort of events were happening in those years where we're seeing the most amount of change. Next slide. And then we get into interpreting some of the results. So we can break it up by watershed, which for us each of our islands is a HUC 12. So we break it out by island. And then you can also see what are the change agents, and that's that table on the right. So we're seeing that in this case, the highest agent of change was tree removal. And we in our county don't have a lot of natural change agents. It's such a fractional percent that we've removed it from this data example, but you could look at that as well. Next slide. So I just want to go back to this slide and highlight again that we're talking about change in baseline rates, not change in general, and just going back to this goal of have we maintained the baseline rate of canopy loss and impervious, semi-impervious gain within riparian zones, and the different ways we can answer that question. Next slide. But really, I want to go back to if we were just to look at the number of change based on HRCD, we wouldn't have the whole picture. So how we're planning on getting that entire picture is really through using other data and comparing the two. And where we can't show gains, we can show gains in other assessment tools or data monitoring. And that we can use things like BMP implementation and looking at really how many acres of restoration or enhancement offset the rates of loss that we see through HRCD. And this is still something we're working on developing as we develop our monitoring plan. And then next year, as we get into our next 5-year report. But really, we're looking at the different ways we can answer that question of, can we use acres to acres, or how do we establish a similar offset balance to really get the full picture? And next slide. So this is one example of one way we're hoping to answer that question. In the last 2 years, the district has planted 18.7 acres of riparian forest buffer with many of our partners. And you can see here, this is our Island Conservation Corps planting those forest buffers. And next slide. So then if we look back at this table and we see that our 2.18 acres of change in that 2011 to 2019 period, we're actually offset even in just 2 years by, over 9 times that amount. So if we're comparing then the amount lost through loss of tree coverage, we're actually gaining a lot down the line with the plantings of new riparian forest buffers. So this is just an example of one way that we can show the different comparison models by using HRCD as our base, but also bringing in other sources of data to answer our questions on our goals and benchmarks. Great, and I'll leave questions for the end. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pauline. Yeah, so hopefully that puts some context to how this starts to fit together. And that's just one way of doing this. There's so many options that they're still exploring and that others can still explore. And just as a basic overview or summary of what I heard is, starting with the change locations, these HRCD polygons, and then bring in other data sets. So riparian boundaries or the ag lands. And then you can start to look at where that change is happening. So we can look at riparian change. And really then start to compare that to the other data sets that Pauline was mentioning. So for VSP, what else is available? Really want to integrate how our data is being used with VSP. And so we have on our website, we have a page specific for VSP where we provide easy to find accuracy and quality assurance information. The 5-year reports are a huge lift for counties. And so we try to provide the data. We work with the Conservation Commission and Levi and folks to make sure that the information that we're giving out, the metadata that we're providing, is written in a way that's actually useful and connects to the 5-year reports. We also have some tips on analyzing the high resolution change detection data for 5-year monitoring. We have a guide on there for those of you who are visual learners. It's very similar to the process that Pauline started to allude to. And we also provide consultation with DFW or HRCD staff. When San Juan went through the process of adaptive monitoring in 2021 to update their plan, they contacted us and said, hey, here are indicators that we're thinking of. Is this something that we could accurately monitor? Are we using your data in an appropriate way? And here's the GIS analysis we did and the results we saw. Does this look right? Did we do this? Are these results meaningful? Or are we doing this using the data correctly? So we're happy to provide those resources as well. And of course, we have workshop number 2, where we'll get into the details of how to actually run these analyses and get your answers. Now, just a brief plug, we have some related WDFW data. We have a high resolution land cover data product. And depending on what county you're in, you can contact me to find out more. We have 2011, 2017, and 2021 land cover data, which includes vegetation and vegetation height information. So if you're thinking about a 100-foot tree, but it's been replaced with a 15-foot tree, would indicate that change. You could compare that from 2011 to 2021. The land cover data sets also include information on visible surface water, including streams and gravel along the streams, non-vegetated classes. So while we don't monitor growth, I think there is an opportunity. We haven't done it yet, so I'm going to speak very cautiously on this, but I think there's an opportunity for someone in the room to explore this option of comparing the 2011 land cover data to the 2021 data to see if we can actually start to see tree growth over that 10-year period. It's a little bit different than looking at a 2-year time period. There's a lot of cautions around that, and we'll get into those details perhaps at the next workshop about why we don't just subtract two land cover data sets. Lots of errors can come into it. But if you're really wanting to look into that, I think there's an opportunity, but it's going to need a little bit of research. Okay, and we have one more question for the group. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah. So we're curious about after going through a lot of this information, at this point, how might you use this data to inform your VSP monitoring needs? So we're curious about that. I think it's a good way to munch on what we've been talking about today, and then also helps with going forward with our next workshop and some things that are key points for that workshop as well. So you should feel free to type in there. I believe that this will still stay up after we move on to the next slide. So if you're starting and you just want to keep going, I think it'll let you do that. So we'll see a few up here as they start to come in. I'm seeing a theme.
Me too.
It's a good thing. These are all really awesome things.
See some questions on here that we can answer soon for folks. I'm gonna move on and keep adding these because we will summarize these. See what we can ask about. So one of the questions that I saw in there, I'll let Emma take away.
Yeah, so a lot of questions about obtaining the data. How do we get the data? Where is the data available? We've created some availability maps. So this is our first availability map, and this is showing in that light green. If you're a light green county, we have full HRCD data availability through 2017. If you're a dark green county, we have data funded through VSP. And so currently we have data through 2021 with updates coming for those dark green counties. And then the dark blue counties, that is mostly the east side of the state. And that's funded through a different project for the riparian areas. We're still figuring out how and when this will be available for VSP counties, but that is coming. And then to note, the hash mark is where we have LiDAR available with that LiDAR extent. And so you can see we don't have LiDAR available for Asotin, Grant, and Douglas, so we don't have data available for those. Taking a look into VSP specifics, these are the areas that are funded through the Conservation Commission. So if you are a green county on here, you'll be getting data, 2023 data in June 2025. A lot of 2020s. And if you are one of the pink counties, you'll be receiving that data, that 2023 data in fall of 2025. So rolling into sort of those 2020s, what exactly is that? We have a data collection schedule, so you might be wondering, okay, in 2025, I'm receiving that 2021 to 2023 changes. And that's due to rolling back to Robin talking about our process. So for example, in summer 2021, the NAEP imagery was collected. In summer 2022, Fish and Wildlife receives the 2021 imagery, and then we begin processing that imagery. And then in summer 2023, the 2019 to 2021 change data is available and delivered to our end users. During that same summer, the new 2023 NAEP imagery is collected. So there's sort of this rolling 2-year period of collecting and processing that has to occur. Where can you find the data? We have about 3 different ways of finding our data. One is if you use ArcGIS, you can find it on the online portal. You can also go to the Washington Geospatial Open Data portal. That's online and you can download in multiple formats our data. And then you can also do a data request form off of our website. That's best if you're going for a land cover or the tree canopy data. That's gonna be the best option for that. And if you're wondering what that website is, this is our site on here, HRCD-open.org. wdfw.hub.arcgis.com. If you also Google HRCD, we tend to be the first one to come up. You can learn so much more here. You can download data, you can explore our VSP page, like Robin was talking about, and get access to more of those VSP resources. Or you can also come to our second workshop.
Yeah, so final plug, this workshop was an overview introduction to HRCD and kind of let you figure out if you want to use it. If this is something that you want to use for your county, I encourage you to sign up for workshop part 2. You can send maybe one of your GIS staff to this. We're going to get into a little bit more technical skills. So you want some basic GIS skills, and we'll explore the data, analyze it, interpret the results. So hopefully you can answer those VSP monitoring questions that are specific to your needs. That is June 7th from 10 to noon. And we do have some time left over for questions, and it looked like there were plenty of questions coming in. So pass them on.
Yeah, I've got a question from Pauline. The baseline rate of change is based on 2006 to 2011. How do you know that that's your preferred target rate? That's not higher or lower than typical due to a short-term economic or migration trend?
That is a great question, and one I don't think I have the answer to. Yeah, we chose that one because it's based on what we had available. Do we know what led to that baseline rate or not? I don't know. I could certainly look into it, but it's not something, yeah, it's not something I have the answer to right now.
Okay. Well, I saw a bunch of questions in the last Slido poll, and people were asking, I'm not sure if this is available for my county. And if your questions weren't fully answered in the slides that Emma showed in those maps, feel free to contact us and ask us about when will it be available, what's holding this up, how do I make it, if there's no LiDAR, there's no funding, there's a struggle there, but it may be funded through other programs, and we can give you some more detailed information about your specific county. Looking for other questions.
Second training.
Cool, yeah. We'll put some links in there, and these slides will also be shared, and they have some links in there as well. Well, I appreciate everyone for being here today. You got some questions answered, and we'll see you at part 2 in a couple weeks. And feel free to email us if you have other questions that pop up later.